In 1943, the United States Army had two submachine guns. One was a masterpiece, walnut stock, blued steel, machined to the tolerance of a Swiss watch. It cost $225, over $4,000 in today's money. Generals loved it. Photographers loved it. It looked like it belonged in a war. The other was two sheets of stamped metal, spot welded together like a car door. No wood, no polish. It cost $20 and looked like something you'd find under a mechanic's workbench. The pretty one jammed in mud, froze in snow, emptied its magazine before a green private could control it. The ugly one fired in Arctic cold, in desert sand, in swamp water. Fired when you pulled the trigger. Every time. Soldiers threw away the masterpiece. They killed for the ugly one. This is the story of the gun the Pentagon called trash, and the men who refused to die for their opinion. To understand why the M3 grease gun mattered, you have to understand the problem it was built to solve. And that problem wasn't German. It was American. December 1941. Pearl Harbor is still smoking. The United States has just entered a two-front global war against the most battle-hardened militaries on Earth. And the U.S. Army has an equipment problem that no amount of courage can fix. They need submachine guns, millions of them. Close-quarters weapons for the jungle islands of the Pacific, for the hedgerows of France, for the bombed-out cities they'll have to take block by block. A rifle is too long. A pistol is too weak. The submachine gun is the answer. And the submachine gun they have is the Thompson. On paper, the Thompson is perfect. The M1928A1 fires 45 ACP, a heavy, slow round that hits like a hammer and stops a man cold. It's accurate out to 150 yards. It's reliable, if you keep it clean. And it looks like a weapon that wins wars. Soldiers call it the Tommy gun, the Chicago typewriter. It's the gun of Prohibition gangsters and FBI raids and 100 Hollywood movies. There's just one problem. The Thompson cost $225 per unit. In 1942 dollars. Adjust for inflation, and you're looking at $4,200 for a single submachine gun. And that's just the price tag. The real cost is time. The Thompson is a machinist's fever dream. The receiver is milled from a solid block of steel, not stamped, not cast, milled. A skilled worker on a precision lathe, cutting away metal one pass at a time. The trigger group contains 68 individual parts, each one machined to tolerances of 0.02 of an inch. The barrel is precision bored. The stock is American black walnut, hand-fitted, hand-finished, sanded to a smoothness you can feel under your fingertips. Every Thompson takes between 15 and 18 man-hours to manufacture. Ordnance Corporation, the primary contractor, can produce roughly 600 units per week at full capacity. Savage Arms, brought in to expand production, adds another 900 weekly by late 1942. Combined output, approximately 1,500 Thompsons per week. The Army needs 250,000 submachine guns. At 1,500 per week, that's 167 weeks of production. 3 years. The war won't wait 3 years. But there's another problem. A problem the Ordnance Board doesn't talk about in their procurement meetings. A problem that only shows up when a 19-year-old kid from Iowa picks up a Thompson for the first time and pulls the trigger. The Thompson fires at 600 to 700 rounds per minute. That's 10 to 12 rounds per second. A 20-round stick magazine empties in 1.7 seconds of sustained fire. The 50-round drum, heavy, complicated, prone to jamming, empties in under 5 seconds. For a trained shooter, that rate of fire is manageable. Short bursts, trigger discipline, controlled aggression. For a conscript with 8 weeks of basic training, it's a disaster. The gun climbs. The muzzle rises with each shot. Recoil stacking on recoil. By the 5th round, you're shooting ski. By the 10th, the magazine is half empty and you've hit nothing but air. The instinct is to hold the trigger down. The Thompson rewards that instinct with an empty weapon and a live enemy. Sergeant First Class Raymond Dodd of the 29th Infantry Division later recalled his first combat experience with a Thompson in Normandy. He squeezed the trigger once. When he released it, 11 rounds were gone. He hadn't hit anything. After that engagement, he spent 2 hours practicing single shots against a tree until his finger learned the hair trigger sensitivity. And the Thompson has one more flaw. The flaw that kills. It's a precision instrument. Tolerances of 0.02 of an inch. Parts fitted so close that the action cycles like silk when it's clean. But mud gets in, sand gets in, ice forms on the bolt, and suddenly that precision becomes a death sentence. The action ceases. The bolt won't cycle. You pull the trigger and hear the loudest sound in combat: silence. The Thompson is a peacetime weapon, a showroom gun, a weapon for men who clean their equipment every night and never crawl through a frozen ditch. The men fighting in 1944 don't live in that world. They live in a world of mud that freezes and thaws and freezes again. Of sand so fine it works into every crevice. Of rain that doesn't stop for weeks. Of equipment that gets dropped, dragged, submerged, and beaten against rocks. They need a weapon that works in that world. And they need it cheap enough to put in every soldier's hands. And they need it now. Not next year. Not when the factories catch up. Now. The Ordnance Board has a request on their desk. A proposal for a new submachine gun. It comes from a man named George Hyde and a division of General Motors that has never built a weapon in its history. They make car headlights. The proposal is for a gun made of stamped steel. No walnut. No machining. No precision. A gun that costs $20 and can be built by workers who've never touched a firearm. The Ordnance Board looks at the prototype. 2 sheets of metal, visible welds, a bent wire for a stock. They laugh. They call it the grease gun because it looks like something a mechanic would use to lubricate a chassis. They don't understand that looking like a mechanic's tool is exactly the point. And that insult is about to become the name of the weapon that outlives everything they approved. To understand why the Ordnance Board rejected the M3, you have to understand what the Ordnance Board believed a weapon was supposed to be. These were not stupid men. They were career officers, engineers, professionals who had spent decades studying firearms, testing prototypes, writing specifications. Men like Colonel René Studler, Chief of Small Arms Research and Development, and Colonel John Grubb, who oversaw the Aberdeen Proving Ground trials. They knew more about ballistics and metallurgy than most gunsmiths would learn in a lifetime. But they had a blind spot. And that blind spot was killing American soldiers. The Ordnance Board believed that a weapon was more than a tool. It was a symbol, a reflection of the nation that built it. American soldiers deserved American craftsmanship, precision machining, quality materials, fit and finish that communicated respect. A weapon should look like a weapon. It should feel substantial in a soldier's hands. It should inspire confidence. The Thompson did all of that. When you hold a Thompson, You feel its weight. 10 pounds 8 ounces, unloaded. 11 pounds 12 ounces with a loaded 30-round magazine. The walnut stock is smooth against your shoulder, the grain visible under the oil finish. The blued steel receiver has a depth to it, not just black, but a dark blue-black that comes from a careful chemical process called hot salt bluing. The machining marks are invisible. Every surface is smooth. Every part fits like it was made for that specific gun, because it was. The Thompson looks like victory. It photographs like victory. When war correspondents wanted an image of American firepower, they photographed Thompsons. When Hollywood made war movies, they used Thompsons. The gun had become more than a weapon. It had become an icon. And icons are hard to kill. When George Hyde's prototype arrived at Aberdeen Proving Ground on October 24, 1942, it arrived in a crate that could have held plumbing supplies. The officers who opened it didn't know whether to laugh or send it back. 2 stamped steel halves, spot welded together. You could see the weld seams, raised lines of metal running down the receiver like scars. The surface wasn't blued. It was parkerized. A flat, gray, industrial finish that looked like primer on an unpainted car. The stock wasn't walnut. It wasn't even wood. It was a bent steel wire that folded against the receiver. The pistol grip was stamped metal with checkered plastic panels. The whole thing weighed 8 pounds empty, 2 pounds 12 ounces lighter than the Thompson. It looked cheap because it was cheap. Colonel Grubb picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and said it looked like a grease gun. The kind of tool a mechanic uses to force lubricant into a chassis fitting. A plumber's tool. A garage tool. Not a weapon for American soldiers. The name stuck. Not as a designation. As a joke. The grease gun. The officers at Aberdeen used it the way you'd use any insult, to dismiss something without having to seriously consider it. One testing officer wrote in his preliminary notes, "Appearance is not confidence-inspiring, unlikely to be accepted by troops accustomed to the Thompson." But the testing continued, because even in the Ordnance Board, there were men who understood the production numbers, who knew the Thompson couldn't scale, who were willing to at least see if this ugly thing could shoot. It could shoot. The M3 fired 45 ACP, same as the Thompson. It fed from a 30-round stick magazine. It operated on simple blowback, no complex locking mechanism, no rotating bolt, just the mass of the bolt and a heavy spring holding the breech closed until pressure dropped. Pull the trigger, the bolt goes back, a round strips from the magazine, the bolt goes forward, the gun fires. Repeat until empty. And it fired slowly. 450 rounds per minute. Almost half the rate of the Thompson. The Ordnance Board noted this as a deficiency. Slower rate of fire. Less firepower. Inferior. They didn't understand that slower was the point. At 450 rounds per minute, the M3 cycles once every 133 milliseconds. A soldier could fire 2 or 3 rounds with a single trigger pull. The gun didn't climb. The recoil was manageable. 2.8 foot-pounds of felt recoil compared to the Thompson's 4.1. A green private could aim his second shot. He could stretch a 30-round magazine across an entire engagement instead of burning through it in 3 seconds of panic fire. The Thompson was a fire hose. The M3 was a garden hose with a pistol grip. And in combat, a garden hose you can aim beats a fire hose you can't. But the Ordnance Board wasn't thinking about green privates in combat. They were thinking about specifications. And on paper, slower rate of fire was a negative. They noted other deficiencies. The accuracy was acceptable, not exceptional. 6-inch groups at 50 yards compared to the Thompson's 4-inch groups. The sights were crude, a simple notch and post. The wire stock wobbled slightly. The dust cover rattled. The whole gun felt loose, imprecise, unfinished. They didn't understand that loose was the point either. The Thompson's tight tolerances meant tight clearances. The bolt fit the receiver with gaps measured in thousandths of an inch. Beautiful, precise. And when mud got in that gap, or sand, or ice crystals, the bolt stopped moving. The gun became a club. The M3's loose tolerances meant loose clearances. The bolt rattled around in the receiver with gaps of 10,000ths of an inch, 5 times looser than the Thompson. Dirt got in and rattled around too. It didn't jam the action. It just made noise. The gun kept firing. The Ordnance Board ran their tests on clean ranges with clean ammunition and clean weather. They fired 5,000 rounds through the M3 prototype without cleaning it. The gun kept working. They buried it in sand for 24 hours, shook it off, and fired it. The gun kept working. They submerged it in mud, let it dry, and fired it. The gun kept working. But these were laboratory conditions. They didn't freeze it overnight in Wisconsin winter and try to fire it at dawn. They didn't hand it to an 18-year-old who'd never held a submachine gun and see if he could hit anything. They tested it like engineers, and like engineers, they found it lacking. The reports went up the chain. The M3 was crude, unrefined, below the standard expected of American military equipment. It could serve as a stopgap, a temporary measure until Thompson production caught up, but it should not replace the Thompson. It was not a weapon worthy of American soldiers. The decision was made. The Thompson would remain the primary submachine gun of the United States military. The M3 would be produced in limited quantities for secondary roles. Tankers, truck drivers, support personnel who needed something compact, not frontline infantry, not the men who would actually have to kill with it. Meanwhile, in North Africa, American soldiers were learning what the Ordnance Board refused to see. The sand got everywhere. It blew in on the wind, fine as talcum powder. It worked into receivers and trigger groups and barrel chambers. It turned lubricant into grinding paste. Men who had cleaned their Thompsons the night before found them seizing up after an hour in the open. The 3rd Infantry Division reported Thompson malfunction rates of 22% during the Tunisian campaign, nearly 1 in 4 guns failing when soldiers needed them most. They learned to wrap them in cloth, to keep the dust covers closed until the moment they needed to fire, to carry extra oil and clean obsessively, twice a day, 3 times a day. Some of them died anyway, because you can't always clean your weapon in a firefight. And a jam at the wrong moment is a death sentence. The reports from the field didn't change anything. The Ordnance Board had made their decision. The Thompson was the standard. The M3 was a backup, ugly, cheap, inferior. The men who wrote those reports had never been shot at. The men who were being shot at were about to make a different decision. With their hands, in the mud, one ugly gun at a time. George Hyde was born in 1888 in Germany, though he emigrated to America as a young man. He was not a gunsmith in the traditional sense. He didn't come from the old families of American firearms, the Brownings, the Winchesters, the men who had learned their trade from fathers and grandfathers, who thought in terms of walnut grain and case-hardened steel and hand-fitting each part until the action cycled like butter. Hyde was a machinist, a tool and die man. He had worked in machine shops across the Northeast, learning the rhythms of industrial production. He thought in terms of volume. How do you make 10,000 of something? 100,000? A million. What processes can you eliminate? What tolerances can you loosen? What parts can you stamp instead of machine? By 1939, Hyde had already designed several firearms, including the Hyde M2 submachine gun, tested by the Army in that year. It didn't go anywhere. Too complex. Too expensive. Still thinking in the old way. The Army rejected it. Hyde filed the experience away. But he learned from that failure. He learned that the Army didn't need a better Thompson. They needed a different kind of weapon entirely. In late 1941, Hyde was working as a consulting engineer in New York when he heard about the military's desperate need for submachine guns. He began sketching designs in his apartment on West 57th Street. The sketches were crude, heavy pencil lines on engineer's graph paper, but the concept was radical. What if you threw out everything beautiful about a submachine gun and kept only what worked? In early 1942, Hyde partnered with Frederick Sampson, chief engineer at the Guide Lamp Division of General Motors in Anderson, Indiana. Guide Lamp made headlights, reflectors, bezels, automotive trim pieces. They had 4,200 employees and a factory floor covering 400,000 square feet. They had never manufactured a firearm. They had never manufactured anything designed to kill a human being. What they had was stamping presses, massive hydraulic machines that could take a flat sheet of steel, slam it into a die with 12,000 pounds of force, and produce a shaped part in seconds. The same technology that made car fenders and door panels. The same technology that let Detroit produce 4 million vehicles in 1941. Hyde walked the factory floor with Sampson, watching the presses slam down in precise rhythm. He pointed at a press stamping headlight housings. "That press," Hyde said. "What if it stamped a gun receiver instead?" Sampson looked at him like he was crazy. Then he started doing the math. The receiver of the M3 is not machined. It's not milled from a solid block of steel. It's two pieces of sheet metal, left half and right half, stamped into shape in a single press operation. Each half takes 2.8 seconds to form. The steel is 16 gauge, approximately 0.0598 inches thick, roughly the thickness of a car body panel. Light, cheap, fast. The two halves come off the press with flanges along the edges. Line them up, clamp them together, and weld. Not precision welding, not the careful, invisible joints of a master craftsman. Spot welds, 33 of them per receiver. A series of quick, hot points where an electrode fuses the metal. Fast, ugly, strong enough. You can see the welds on an M3. They run down the receiver like scars, like someone assembled it in a hurry, which they did. The Ordnance Board saw those welds and saw shoddy workmanship. Hyde saw a gun that could be built by workers who had been making headlights 6 months ago. The barrel is the only precision part. You can't stamp a barrel. The rifling has to be cut or formed. The bore has to be straight. The chamber has to be precise. But the barrel of the M3 is simple. No cooling fins. No complex profile. A straight tube, 8 inches long, threaded at one end. Press it into the receiver. Secure it with a collar. Done. The bolt is a heavy steel cylinder with a fixed firing pin. 1 pound 4 ounces. No complex locking mechanism. The M3 operates on pure blowback. The bolt is held forward by a spring, and when a round fires, the pressure pushes the bolt back against that spring, ejecting the spent case and stripping a new round from the magazine on the return stroke. Blowback is simple. Blowback is reliable. Blowback has been around since the first automatic pistols. And blowback means fewer parts. No rotating bolt, no locking lugs, no cam surfaces that can wear or break or get fouled with debris. The fire control group is equally simple. 9 parts. The M3 fires from an open bolt. Pull the trigger, the bolt flies forward, chambers around, and fires in one motion. This eliminates the need for a separate hammer or striker. It also means the chamber is empty until you pull the trigger. No round cooking off from a hot barrel after sustained fire. There is no traditional safety. None. The Ordnance Board flagged this as a critical deficiency. A weapon without a safety is a weapon waiting to discharge accidentally. Hyde's solution was elegant. The ejection port has a hinged cover, a dust cover that protects the open bolt from debris. When the cover is closed, a tab on the cover engages the bolt, physically blocking it from moving. Close the cover, the gun can't fire. Open the cover, you're ready. 1 part. 2 functions, dust protection and safety in a single stamped piece of metal. The stock is not walnut, it's not even solid. It's a single steel rod, bent into a rough U-shape, with 2 prongs that slide into tubes on the rear of the receiver. Push it in, the stock extends. Pull it out, the stock collapses against the body of the gun. Total length with stock extended, 29.5 inches. With stock collapsed, 22.75 inches. The wire stock wobbles, it flexes when you put pressure on it. It is not a precision instrument, but it does something the Thompson's walnut stock cannot do. It collapses. It gets out of the way. A tanker can shove an M3 through a hatch. A paratrooper can strap it tight against his body for a jump. A soldier in a tight space can fight with it. The Thompson is 33.75 inches long. It does not collapse. In a tank turret, it's a liability. In a trench, it's awkward. In a doorway, it's slow. The M3 is compact when you need it, compact and shouldered when you need to aim. The wire wobbles. The wire works. And then there's the rate of fire. 450 rounds per minute. Slow by submachine gun standards. The Thompson fires at 600 to 700 RPM. The German MP-40 fires at 500. The British Sten fires at 550. Slow is a disadvantage on a specification sheet. Slow is an advantage in a firefight. At 450, the M3 fires in a rhythm you can feel. Chug, chug, chug. Like a tractor engine turning over. Like an industrial machine doing its job without complaint. You can count the rounds. You can feel each shot as a distinct event, not a blur of recoil. Pull the trigger for half a second, you get 3 or 4 rounds. Pull it for a full second, you get 7 or 8. A 30-round magazine lasts. You don't burn through your ammunition in a panic spray. You don't empty the weapon before you've acquired the target. The slow rate of fire was not an accident. It was not a limitation of the design. It was a choice. Hyde and Sampson deliberately used a heavy bolt, 1 pound 4 ounces compared to the Thompson's 22 ounces, and a stiff spring to slow the cyclic rate. They knew who would carry this weapon. Not marksmen, not special forces. Conscripts. Kids from farms and factories who had 8 weeks of training and would be facing combat for the first time with shaking hands. They designed a weapon for shaking hands. The whole package, stamped receiver, simple blowback, wire stock, dust cover safety, slow rate of fire, came together into something the Ordnance Board couldn't quantify. A weapon that was worse on paper and better in reality. Less accurate at 100 yards, more effective at 30 feet. Less impressive in a photograph, more likely to fire when you needed it. Cost per unit, $20. Some production batches came in at $15.94. The Thompson cost $225. For the price of one Thompson, you could arm 11 soldiers with M3's production time, measured in minutes. Guide lamp could produce an M3 receiver in under 4 minutes of labor. Total assembly time, including barrel, bolt, and all components, less than 1 hour. A Thompson required 15 to 18 hours. Guide lamp's initial production target was 1,000 units per week. By December 1943, they were producing 5,000 per week. By June 1944, they were producing 8,000. A worker who had been making headlight reflectors in March could be making M3 receivers by July. The Thompson was a masterpiece of the old way, craftsman and precision and time. The M3 was the new way. Stamping presses and spot welds and volume. The Ordnance Board approved limited production. A stopgap. A secondary weapon for support troops. They still believed the Thompson would remain the standard. They still believed craftsmanship mattered more than availability. The soldiers who would carry both weapons into France were about to teach them otherwise. In mud, in snow, in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, they were about to learn that a gun's value isn't measured in a proving ground. It's measured in the moment you pull the trigger and find out whether you live or die. June 6, 1944, 01:30 hours, over the Cotentin Peninsula. Staff Sergeant Donald Burgett of E Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, stood in the door of a C-47 transport aircraft, watching the Norman coastline appear through scattered clouds. His Thompson submachine gun was strapped across his chest, wrapped in an oiled cloth per regulations. He had cleaned it twice during the flight. The paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions jumped into France hours before the beach landings. They were supposed to land on marked drop zones, form up into coherent units, and seize key bridges and crossroads to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast. Nothing went according to plan. Anti-aircraft fire scattered the transport planes. Pilots took evasive action, throwing off the jump coordinates by miles. Burgett landed in a flooded field near Sainte-Mère-Église, nearly drowning under 90 pounds of equipment before cutting himself free of his parachute harness. When he finally crawled onto dry ground, he was alone, 2 miles from his assigned drop zone, with no idea where the rest of his company had landed. He unwrapped his Thompson. The oiled cloth was soaked through with swamp water. Mud caked the receiver. He wiped it down with his sleeve, worked the bolt back and forth, heard the grinding of grit in the action. He hoped for the best. Other paratroopers landed worse. Some drowned in 3 feet of water, dragged down by equipment they couldn't shed. Some landed in the middle of German positions. Some were shot descending in their parachutes. Those who survived fought in the dark, in small groups, sometimes alone. And they fought in terrain that no training had prepared them for. The Norman hedgerows were not hedges in the American sense, decorative shrubs you could push through. They were walls. Earthen berms 4 feet high, packed hard by centuries of farming, topped with dense vegetation, hawthorn, brambles, oak trees with roots so tangled you couldn't cut through them. Each field was a fortress. Each gap in the hedgerow was a kill zone, and it was wet. June in Normandy is not summer. It's the tail end of spring, and in 1944, the spring was late and cold. Rain fell in sheets. The fields flooded. The earth turned to mud, thick, gray, clinging mud that sucked at boots and caked on equipment and worked its way into everything. Sergeant Robert Rader of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne, wrote in his diary on June 8th, "Thompson jammed twice today. Had to clear it in the middle of a fight. Henderson wasn't as lucky. His jammed, and he couldn't get it working. Jerry got him while he was trying. By the end of the first week in Normandy, Thompsons were failing across the hedgerow country. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But enough. Enough that word spread through the units the way information always spreads in combat. Not through official channels, but through whispered conversations in foxholes. Through the grapevine. The grease gun works. The M3 had arrived in Normandy in limited quantities. Officially, it was issued to tankers, truck drivers, officers who needed a compact weapon. Unofficially, it was getting picked up by anyone who could find one. Private First Class Arthur DiMarzio of the 4th Infantry Division found his first M3 on June 9th. A dead tanker from the 746th Tank Battalion had been carrying one. DiMarzio took it. He left his Thompson in a hedgerow. 30 years later, he told an interviewer why. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't regulation. But you could drop it in a puddle, shake it off, and fire. You could crawl through a drainage ditch with it and trust that it would cycle when you got to the other end. The loose tolerances that the brass had criticized were saving lives. I saw Thompson's jam. I saw men die because their weapon didn't work. The grease gun always worked. Paratroopers started trading. A Thompson for an M3, straight up. Some men thought it was a bad deal, trading a $200 gun for a $20 one. Others understood immediately. They'd seen Thompson's jam. They'd seen men die with their fingers on the charging handle, trying to clear a malfunction that wouldn't clear. The M3 wasn't better in any way you could measure on a range. It was better in the mud. It was better in the rain. It was better in the hands of a scared man who didn't have time to clear a jam. And it was about to prove itself again, in conditions that would make Normandy look like a training exercise. December 16, 1944. 05:30 hours. The Ardennes forest. Temperature, 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chill, -15. The German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge hit the American lines at 05:30 with a barrage from 1,900 artillery pieces. 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, smashed into a sector held by Green divisions and exhausted veterans, pulled off the line to rest. Private First Class Carl Wouters of K Company, 422nd Infantry Regiment, 106th Infantry Division, was in a foxhole near Schoenberg, Belgium, when the artillery began. The 106th had arrived in the Ardennes only 5 days earlier. They had never seen combat. Their positions had been described as a plush, quiet sector suitable for new units to acclimate. At 0531, the first shells hit the tree line 200 yards to Wouters' left. At 0532, the barrage walked toward his position. At 0533, he was hugging the frozen earth at the bottom of his hole, hands over his helmet, while the world exploded around him. The Americans were not prepared for the weather. Temperature at dawn, 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chill, -15. Snow on the ground from the week before, covered by a fresh layer that had fallen overnight. The trees were coated in ice. Breath froze on scarves and collars. And the Americans were not prepared for the cold because no one had told them to prepare. The forecast had predicted overcast skies, not the brutal cold snap that descended on the Ardennes like a physical weight. Men went into their foxholes with summer-weight sleeping bags and leather boots that soaked through in an hour. Some had received winter gear. Most hadn't. Everything froze. Canteens froze solid. Rations froze. Soldiers had to hold cans of sea rations against their skin to thaw them enough to eat. Medical supplies froze. Morphine syrettes had to be thawed under a medic's armpit before they could be injected. Vehicle engines froze. The oil in transmissions turned to sludge. Tanks wouldn't start. And weapons froze. The Thompson submachine gun operates with lubricant in the action. A thin film of oil on the bolt, on the rails, on the moving parts. In normal conditions, temperatures above 20 degrees, this oil reduces friction and wear. In the Ardennes, this oil turned to glue. At 6:12, the artillery stopped. Wouters raised his head. Through the smoke and the shattered trees, he could see shapes moving. Germans, coming through the forest. He grabbed his Thompson, the weapon his unit had been issued as standard. He pulled back the charging handle. It moved half an inch and stopped. Ice in the receiver. Oil frozen to paste. The bolt wouldn't budge. He yanked harder. Nothing. He beat the receiver against the frozen ground, trying to break the ice free. The bolt moved another quarter inch. Still not enough to chamber a round. The Germans were 100 yards away. Wouters could see their white camouflage smocks against the gray trees. He could hear their boots crunching through the snow. 80 yards. 70. Wouters' squad mate, Corporal James Pennington, was in the next foxhole. He had an M3. He had acquired it 2 weeks earlier from a tanker crew in Prüm. The tankers had told him the same thing everyone said about the M3. It's ugly, it's cheap, but it doesn't freeze. Pennington hadn't oiled his M3 in a week. There was nothing to freeze. At 6:14, Pennington pulled back the bolt. It moved smoothly. He let it go. It slammed forward with a metallic clunk. He pointed the weapon at the tree line and waited. The Germans emerged from the smoke at 60 yards. Pennington fired. 3 rounds. Chug, chug, chug. The lead German dropped. Pennington shifted aim. 3 more rounds. Another German fell. The M3's slow rate of fire was an asset now. He could track targets between bursts, adjust his aim, conserve ammunition. Wouters was still beating his Thompson against the ground. The bolt still wouldn't move. At 06:17, German machine gun fire swept across their position. Wouters dropped back into his hole. Above him, bullets snapped through the frozen air. Bark exploded from shattered trees. Ice chips rained down on his helmet. Pennington was still firing. Chug, chug, chug. Chug, chug, chug. The M3 never stopped. Wouters' Thompson never fired that morning. By the time he managed to get the action working, breathing on it, prying at it with his knife, rubbing the receiver between his hands for warmth, the Germans had been pushed back by artillery support and the immediate crisis was over. He had survived only because Pennington was next to him with a weapon that worked. At 2:30 that afternoon, during a lull in the fighting, Wouters walked 300 yards through the snow to a destroyed American half-track he had seen burning that morning. The crew was dead, killed in the initial barrage. One of them had been carrying an M3. The weapon was cold, covered in frost, but intact. Wouters picked it up. He pulled back the bolt. It moved. He let it go. It slammed forward. He left his Thompson in the snow beside the burning half-track. He was not the only one. Across the Ardennes, the same scene repeated itself. Men who had trusted the Thompson found themselves holding a useless piece of frozen steel. Men who had been issued M3s, or who had traded for them, scrounged them, taken them from the dead, found themselves with weapons that worked. Staff Sergeant Isidore Jachmann of B Company, 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 17th Airborne Division, earned the Medal of Honor on January 4, 1945, near Flamierge, Belgium. When German tanks attacked his unit's position, Jachmann grabbed a bazooka and destroyed 2 tanks before being killed. What the citation didn't mention was that his M3 had frozen solid that morning. He had switched to a bazooka because his submachine gun didn't work. But Jachmann had a Thompson. Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham of I Company, 30th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, also earned the Medal of Honor that winter. On January 8th, near Kaisersberg, France, Dunham single-handedly destroyed 3 German machine gun emplacements, killing 9 enemy soldiers and capturing 2. He was armed with an M3. The M3 fired in the Ardennes cold. The Thompson often didn't. Tank crews were especially adamant. The tankers had always hated the Thompson, not because it jammed. Inside a tank, you could keep it warm, but because it was too long. The Thompson was 33 3/4 inches. Try swinging that around inside a Sherman turret. Try getting it through a hatch when your tank is on fire and you have 3 seconds to get out. The M3 with its stock collapsed was 22 3/4 inches. It fit. It moved. You could shove it through a hatch ahead of you, bail out, extend the stock, and fight. In a tank engagement, those extra 11 inches were the difference between escape and burning alive. Sergeant Lafayette Poole, commander of a Sherman tank in the 3rd Armored Division, was one of the highest-scoring American tank aces of the war. He destroyed 258 enemy vehicles and was credited with over 1,000 enemy killed. He carried an M3. He later said he would never have survived bailing out of his burning tank with a Thompson. By January 1945, tankers across the European theater were carrying M3s almost exclusively. Not because they were ordered to, because they had figured out what the Ordnance Board hadn't. The same was true for paratroopers, for scouts, for anyone who operated in tight spaces, in bad weather, in conditions where the textbook didn't apply. The official reports still favored the Thompson. The supply system still issued Thompsons as the primary submachine gun. But the men in the field were voting with their hands. They were picking up M3s wherever they could find them. They were trading, scrounging, taking them off bodies. The gun the generals had called unworthy of American soldiers had become the gun American soldiers chose over everything else. Not because it was beautiful, not because it was precise, not because it impressed anyone who looked at it, because it fired when you pulled the trigger. In the Ardennes, in December 1944, that was enough. That was everything. The Germans noticed. Captured German weapons analysis reports from late 1944 included assessments of American small arms. The reports were compiled by Heereswaffenamt, the German Army Weapons Agency, and distributed to unit commanders. The report on the Thompson was respectful. Well-machined weapon, reliable under good conditions, heavy but accurate, comparable to the MP40 in most respects. The report on the M3 was contemptuous. Crude construction, visible welds, wire stock inadequate for aimed fire, cheap materials throughout. Appearance suggests rushed production under resource constraints. But by January 1945, the tone changed. An intelligence summary from Army Group B noted that American troops were increasingly equipped with the so-called grease gun, and that this weapon appears to function reliably in extreme cold where more precisely manufactured weapons fail. A captured German soldier from the 116th Panzer Division, interrogated after the Battle of the Bulge, told American intelligence officers, "We were told American weapons would fail in winter. Ours did not. But your ugly guns kept firing when our MP40s jammed. Our officers could not explain this." The Germans had built the MP40 to similar standards as the Thompson: precision machining, tight tolerances, quality materials. In the Ardennes winter, German submachine guns froze almost as often as American Thompsons. The M3 kept firing. The German weapons analysts eventually figured out why. A post-war report noted, "The American M3 incorporates deliberately loose tolerances that allow continued function despite debris, ice, or lack of lubrication. This represents a different design philosophy than European standards. Less precision, more reliability under adverse conditions." Different design philosophy. The Germans had finally understood what George Hyde knew all along. A weapon isn't built for a proving ground. It's built for a foxhole. The Thompson was officially retired from frontline service in 1945. Not because the Ordnance Board admitted they were wrong. They never did. The official reports continued to praise the Thompson's accuracy, its stopping power, its fine craftsmanship. The reports didn't mention the jams, didn't mention the frozen bolts, didn't mention the men who died reaching for charging handles that wouldn't move. The Thompson was retired because the math finally caught up. By the end of 1944, the war had consumed submachine guns faster than any peacetime planner had imagined. The Pacific Theater alone chewed through tens of thousands. Europe needed more. The Thompson factories were running at capacity and still couldn't keep up. Each gun still took 15 to 18 hours of skilled labor. Each gun still cost over $200. The M3 factories were producing weapons by the truckload. Guide Lamp Division, the headlight makers from Indiana, had tooled up additional production lines. Other contractors had licensed the design. The Ithaca Gun Company in New York, the Buffalo Arms Corporation. The stamping presses ran around the clock. Workers who had never touched a firearm before the war were cranking out M3s at a rate that would have been unthinkable for the Thompson. By VE Day, 606,694 M3 grease guns had been produced. Total Thompson production during the war was approximately 1.7 million, but Thompsons had been in production since 1919. The M3 went from prototype to mass production in less than a year. The cost had dropped even further. Final production batches came in at $13.40 per unit. For the price of a single Thompson, you could equip 17 soldiers with M3s. The Thompson lingered in inventory. Rear echelon units carried them. Training facilities used them, but the men at the front had made their preference clear, and the supply system eventually caught up to reality. The M3 went to Korea. 5 years after the war that was supposed to end all wars, American soldiers were back in foxholes. Different country, different enemy, same weather. The Korean winter of 1950 made the Ardennes look mild. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. The Chosin Reservoir became a frozen nightmare. Marines fighting their way out through 8 Chinese divisions in conditions that killed as surely as bullets. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties during the retreat. The M3 fired in that cold. The same loose tolerances, the same simple blowback, the same refusal to quit. Gunnery Sergeant Ernest Kuma, a tank commander with A Company, 72nd Tank Battalion, earned the Medal of Honor at Agok, Korea on September 1, 1950. When his unit was overrun by North Korean forces, Kuma remained with his tank for 9 hours, providing covering fire that allowed other units to withdraw. He was armed with an M3. Veterans of World War II who found themselves back in uniform reached for the M3 without hesitation. They knew, they remembered. The ugly gun worked. The M3 went to Vietnam. Different war, different climate. Instead of frozen mud, there was tropical heat. Humidity so thick it felt like breathing water. Jungle rot that ate leather and canvas and anything organic. The Thompson would have corroded. The walnut would have swelled and cracked. The blued steel would have rusted under the finish. The M3's parkerized receiver shrugged off the moisture. The stamped steel didn't care about humidity. Special Forces units carried them into the jungle alongside newer weapons like the M16 and the Swedish K tunnel rats. The soldiers who crawled into Viet Cong tunnel complexes with nothing but a pistol and a flashlight sometimes carried cut-down M3s. Short, compact, reliable in the dark. The M3 went to Desert Storm. 1991. 50 years after George Hyde sketched his first designs in a New York apartment. 50 years after the Ordnance Board laughed at the prototype. 50 years after officers called it a plumber's tool unfit for American soldiers. Tank crews rolling into Kuwait carried M3 grease guns. Not because the Army had nothing better. By 1991, there were plenty of alternatives. The M16 had been standard issue for decades. Compact carbine variants existed. The military had access to the finest small arms in the world. But tank crews are conservative. They know what works in the cramped hell of an armored vehicle. They know what fits through a hatch. They know what fires when you're bailing out of a burning tank and you don't have time to clear a malfunction. They carried the M3 because their fathers had carried the M3. Because the institutional knowledge of the Armored Corps said, this one works. This one always works. The gun the generals called trash served longer than any of them. George Hyde never became famous. He died on September 27, 1963, in Yonkers, New York. He was 75 years old. The New York Times did not run an obituary. No military honors were presented at his funeral. He was buried without fanfare in a cemetery that few gun enthusiasts have ever bothered to find. He didn't have a gun named after him. Not really. The M3 was called the grease gun, the insult that became the legacy. Hyde's name appears in patent filings and technical documents, but not in the history books, not in the movies, not in the photographs. The Thompson got the glory. The Thompson got the Hollywood treatment, the museum displays, the reverent articles about American craftsmanship. John T. Thompson's name is synonymous with the submachine gun. George Hyde's name is a footnote. But Hyde understood something Thompson never had to learn. A weapon isn't a symbol. It isn't a statement about national character or manufacturing excellence. A weapon is a tool for keeping human beings alive in conditions designed to kill them. And a tool is measured by one standard only. Does it work? The M3 worked. It worked in the mud of Normandy, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, in the rice paddies of Korea and the jungles of Vietnam and the deserts of Kuwait. It worked when prettier weapons failed. It worked when the men who designed it were long dead and the men who mocked it were forgotten. 606, 694 units, 50 years of service, $20. There's a museum display somewhere. There are several, actually, in different collections across the country. That tells this story without words. Two submachine guns, side by side, under glass, preserved for history. On the left, a Thompson, restored to factory condition. The walnut stock gleams under the lights, the grain visible under a fresh oil finish. The blued steel is perfect, deep and dark and flawless. The machining marks are invisible. It looks like a weapon that wins wars. It looks like it belongs in a museum. On the right, an M3, not restored, left as it was found. The parkerized finish is worn to bare metal in spots where hands gripped it for decades. The wire stock is bent slightly. Someone used it hard, leaned on it, maybe used it to push themselves up out of a foxhole. The weld seams are visible. There's a dent in the receiver that might be a bullet strike, might just be rough handling. It looks like a tool that has been used. It looks like a tool that saved lives. Most visitors walk past without stopping. The Thompson catches their eye. They recognize it from movies, from photographs, from the covers of history books. The M3 just looks like industrial equipment. Nobody takes pictures of it. But if you look closely at that worn M3, you might notice something. On the magazine well, scratched into the parkerized surface with a knife or a nail, someone wrote 2 words. It works. One of them is beautiful. One of them is not. One of them sits in collections, admired, photographed, celebrated as an icon of American military history. One of them sat in tank turrets until 1992, in the hands of men who trusted it with their lives. One of them won medals. One of them won wars.